Hello and welcome, everyone. Today, we're unpacking a genuinely fascinating text that reveals a completely unexpected side of ancient monastic life. We're looking at the Vinaya. Now, on the surface, this is the incredibly detailed regulatory framework for Buddhist monastics. But instead of just dry, boring legal codes, what we actually find in these ancient records is a vibrant, sometimes messy, and deeply human story. Okay, let's dive into this explainer and decode the human element in divine law.
When we picture ancient monks, our minds almost automatically go straight to that serene, perfectly tranquil imagery of the Pure Land. We imagine these individuals sitting in perfect harmony, totally untethered from the material world. But, the reality recorded in the Vinaya tells a much different story. These monks were people. They struggled with the exact same daily irritations, material temptations, and petty interpersonal dramas that we do today. The rules we're going to look at weren't just handed down in some theoretical vacuum. They were direct, practical responses to real monks behaving badly.
Section 1. Minimalist Living in Buddha's Time.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how specific it gets. You might think minimalism just came naturally to monks, right? But the texts reveal an opportunistic monk named Upananda. He was wandering through a market with a merchant's son when he spotted this perfectly round, super aesthetically pleasing clay bowl. Even though he already had a perfectly functional bowl, he demanded this new one simply because it looked cool. When the other monks found out, they were absolutely appalled by his consumerist attitude and reported him. So to curb this, the Buddha had to literally define exactly what constituted a monastic bowl. An upper bowl was strictly defined as holding exactly 3 portions of rice, 1 of soup, and a half portion of other food. A lower bowl, exactly 1 portion of rice, a half portion of soup, and a half portion of food. Anything bigger or smaller wasn't even legally considered a bowl. The Buddha was setting hard, undeniable specs to stop these guys from endlessly shopping for the perfect dining set.
But defining the size wasn't enough. They had to regulate the actual replacement cycle. And this brings us to what is basically the ultimate ancient anti-consumerism policy, the 5-mend rule. The law explicitly stated that a monk could not request a new bowl simply because their old one was a little worn out. Unless their current bowl was legitimately broken and had been patched or mended fewer than 5 times, asking for a new one was a punishable offense. You had to truly actually wear out your possessions.
And if you broke that rule, the punishment was a highly structured, honestly kind of hilarious public forfeiture ritual. The offending monk had to fill their shiny, unlawfully acquired new bowl with water so, it couldn't be easily hidden in their robes, and stand before the entire assembly. They had to offer it to the most senior monk. If he didn't want it, it was passed down the hierarchy. This kept going until the absolute worst, most battered, chipped bowl in the entire monastery was left over, and the offender was forced to take it. It was a brilliant, practical way to instantly cure someone of their materialistic pride.
Section 2. Material Temptations in the Sangha.
So bowls obviously weren't the only luxury item causing problems. The texts frequently mention this notorious clique known as the Six-Group monks. These guys repeatedly bent the rules, exploiting their spiritual status to pressure lay people for custom-made, highly luxurious robes that were way beyond basic survival needs. Look at this incredibly relatable quote from a disgruntled layman whose perfectly good yarn was completely wasted. He had arranged for a weaver to make a standard robe, but the monks secretly went to the weaver and demanded the robe be woven extra wide, exceptionally fine, and tightly knit. The layman practically shouts in the text, "Why supply these hard-to-satisfy people? My yarn was used 3 times over just to make one garment." I mean, you can literally feel his irritation. The monk's greed was actively destroying the community's goodwill.
And this brilliantly illustrates the Buddhist response. He rolled out strict legalese to protect the public. He created this complex legal grid detailing exactly who a monk could ask for yarn and who could weave it. If a monk asked a relative for yarn, totally fine. But if they asked a non-relative and then forced a non-relative weaver to make it, it triggered severe penalties, specifically a pauxidia, which requires forfeiture and confession, or a dukkata, a formal offense. This wasn't just spiritual guidance, this was straight-up consumer protection law designed to shield the public from monastic exploitation.
Section 3. Emotion Management and Property Disputes.
It's super easy to assume that spending your life in meditation just magically cures you of all anger, right? But the Vinaya shows us that even seasoned monks bickered, held grudges, and totally used their limited property as leverage against one another. A perfect example of this is the story of the Give and Snatch, featuring our old troublesome friend Upananda. He had an apprentice named Dharma. So Upananda gave Dharma a robe, but later demanded that Dharma pack up and travel with him to another region. Well, Dharma refused. He wanted to stay near the Buddha to hear him teach. Upananda threw an absolute tantrum. In a fit of petty anger, he snatched back the previously gifted robe, leaving poor Dharma standing at the gates crying. When the Buddha found out, he immediately laid down a rule. You absolutely cannot give a gift to another monk and then, out of anger or hatred, forcefully take it back. To make sure they were actually keeping track of their stuff, a strict rule of 6 was established. There was this monk named Bihei who once left his heavy outer robe in the woods while he went into town, and yeah, predictably, it was lost. To prevent this kind of carelessness, a strict limit was set. A monk could not be separated from his 3 primary robes for more than 6 nights. If you stepped out of your designated boundary without your robes for a 7th night, you forfeited them. You were forced to be hyper-aware of the very few possessions you were actually allowed to have.
Section 4. Lay offerings and social operations.
Now, the monastic community didn't exist in a bubble. They were deeply embedded in the political, military, and economic fabric of the ancient cities around them. We see this profound connection in this epic anecdote involving a nun named Dharmadina. She lived near a military camp belonging to King Prasenjit's generals. These men were incredibly rowdy, constantly drunk, shouting, and completely ruining her meditation. But instead of just complaining about it, she actively intervened. She invited the leaders over, fed them, and eventually convinced them to take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And the text notes that, because they stopped drinking and fighting all the time, their households grew wealthy, their military discipline improved, and they actually became highly victorious in battle. Even the king himself respected them more. Talk about a real game changer.
Let's move to and see how this builds to a massive, dramatic climax. Because the generals became so wealthy and successful, they invited the Buddha and the entire Sangha for the Vasa, which was the 3-month summer retreat promising to supply all their food and robes. But in month 2, a rebellion broke out. War suddenly returns. Just 10 days before the retreat officially ended, the generals were called to the front lines. Fearing they might die in battle and lose the spiritual merit of their massive donation, they rushed to the monastery to distribute the robes early. Now, normally, monks were strictly forbidden from accepting robes before the retreat ended, but recognizing the life-or-death pressure these soldiers were under, the Buddha created a specific, pragmatic legal exception just for emergency robe distribution.
However, all this influx of lay wealth also brought a good amount of corruption. In another instance, a layman wanted to donate food and precious robes to the entire monastic community. But those old troublemakers, the 6-group monks, caught wind of this. They intercepted the layman before the official distribution, manipulated him with sweet talk, and actually convinced him that the communal storage would just let the robes rot. They successfully diverted the communal Sangha property directly into their own hands. This blatant embezzlement forced the creation of early anti-corruption laws, making it a severe offense to knowingly divert communal goods for personal gain.
Section 5. The boundary of medicine and hoarding. So the Buddha compassionately allowed sick monks to consume high-calorie, valuable goods like ghee, oil, honey, and rock sugar as medicine. But human nature being what it is, some definitely took advantage of this compassion. Enter a monk named Pilandavatsa. He was highly respected and received massive donations of these medical sweets. But instead of just using what he needed, he hoarded them. He filled bowls, pots, and eventually just started hanging literal bags of ghee and honey from ivory pegs on his walls. As you can imagine, in the intense Indian heat, the bags leaked. The text paints this highly memorable, honestly super gross visual of Pilandavatsa's room. Walls stained with rancid fat, bedding completely ruined, and the whole place infested with bugs and smelling terrible. It is the absolute furthest thing from a serene bodhisattva background.
Because Pilandavatsa's sticky room became a literal public health hazard and a glaring symbol of greed, the Buddha intervened, establishing a strict 7-day limit. A sick monk was allowed to accept these 4 medicines, but they could only keep them for a maximum of 7 days. On day 8, keeping that medicine officially transitioned from healthcare into illicit hoarding, and it absolutely had to be forfeited.
So the crucial point is how flawless the logistical accounting for this was. What if a monk receives ghee on Monday and then gets more on Wednesday? Well, the Buddha precisely mapped out the daily limits. Whether stockpiled back-to-back or acquired sporadically over the week, the accounting had to be exact. By the end of the 7th day from the first acquisition, that batch had to be consumed, shared with someone else, or purified through a specific ritual. Otherwise, by dawn of the 8th day, it was a violation. It was a rigorous, foolproof system designed to prevent the long-term stockpiling of sweet, highly valuable goods.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. We've seen petty theft, gross hoarding, anger, and blatant manipulation today.
If absolute perfection was impossible, even for ancient monks living right next to the Buddha, perhaps we should view the Vinaya not as a strict, impossible standard, but as a brilliant, pragmatic guide to realistic community management. It acknowledges that humans are flawed, and it builds a system to gently but firmly guide us back to balance. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the beautifully human reality of ancient divine law. See you next time.